And just to kick off, just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in Melbourne, where Peter and I are, and RMIT University is located. And just to give you a little bit of context about RMIT Forward, where we work and who we're representing today. RMIT is one of the biggest universities in Australia, the Royal Melbourne Institute for Technology. And we sit in a fairly newly formed centre called the Centre for Future Skills and Workforce Transformation. And we kind of deliberately defy definition in terms of what we do. We do a bit of research, but we like to think of ourselves as very applied in terms of our thinking. And we've got a networked model. So Peter and I are part of a small core team, but we have a international network of industry fellows, and Lena's one of our esteemed fellows, and we really appreciate her contributions and in turn these opportunities to speak with you all. And we're going to be talking today about the AI in the context of small business. Should also mention that we sit within a college in the university, the College for Vocational Education, which is, it's quite funny. We've got this room that we've set up, and we've incorporated a lot of Indigenous art and furnishings and those kinds of things to make it a very creative and sort of inviting space. But we sit within a building which is for applied manufacturing. So we're surrounded by 3D printers and robots and that kind of thing. I think that kind of defines the college we sit within is plumbers and nurses, and it's vocational and it's skills, and it's about business and learning and getting things done. So we've got that interesting blend of really thinking about the future of work, but also grounded in the practicalities of what work really means and getting things done. And perhaps one of our core observations or messages for today, and you'll be familiar with this quote, that the future is already here and it's just not evenly distributed. AI is not all that new. It's it's been in development for a long time, but everyone's seeing graphs that look like this. I just sort of grabbed one fairly randomly. This one happens to be about the amount of funding going into a particular type of AI, being generative AI and things like ChatGPT and the large language models that we're becoming familiar with very fast. But yeah, it feels like this, right? That suddenly it's exponential. It's everywhere. It's on everybody's lips, including ours. But I think part of the point is it's been around a while, and the big end of town, if you like, the people with the resources to invest in emerging technologies have been harnessing the benefits of that for some time. Whereas, so here's an example, McKinsey, as one example, one of the biggest consulting firms in the world, here with a recent announcement of them having developed their own AI tool called Lily, where they've used their own proprietary data, and they're making that available as an internal tool for their people, and that's going to give them a really important competitive advantage in their market. Sharing this framework, this really helps me think about technology. I'm not sure if anyone's come across it before. It's called Wardley mapping. I'll just draw your attention to the bold line going through the center, and below it, those descriptors. And it's extremely common sense in a lot of ways, that basically everything's on a journey from Genesis. Everything starts as an idea, or it doesn't exist, and it goes on a journey of evolution and maturity through, from an idea to being something that's custom built. Eventually it will become more standardized and productized, until eventually, again, it becomes a commodity. It's everywhere. So I've just popped some examples above that, if we look at the right side, I would say something like text autocomplete, I think, is a commodity, and we see it everywhere. If you type something into a Google search bar, and auto completes the sentence for you. You do it in a Google Doc, you do it anywhere. That style of AI, if you like, or broadly what we're talking about here, is a commodity, and we'd expect to see that basically everywhere. I think what's happened recently is that ChatGPT has it's become a product. It's become very accessible to everybody, and it's passed some kind of tipping point in terms of usefulness. I'd be interested to know that that actual product itself, ChatGPT and OpenAI, who provide that's been around since 2020, almost in its current form, but they just hadn't quite cracked the nut of the user interface that so many of us have now used and are so comfortable and familiar with, of the chat interface. And that's been the big unlock. And there's been other factors contributing, but there's certainly something that's recently happened to bring it to this point of maturity where it's a product that lots of people can access. As we look further left on the spectrum, these private large language models, like the example I showed you from McKinsey, is more like a custom built version, and that's not available to everybody. And I think there's a very interesting difference and tension between the other side of that line, where something is custom built, that it's got some unique properties or characteristics to it, and can provide some kind of unique capability or advantage to a business, versus something that's on the other side of the line, and it's a product that's very universally available and applied. So that's really at the center of what we'll be exploring and talking about some more. And just to sort of round out this model, very far on the left, there's the question of, well, what's coming next in terms of AI? Of course, I popped it into ChatGPT and asked the question, and there's, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something to do with sentient analysis using quantum computing. Apparently, is something that's at that end of the spectrum, that's in the lab. But sure enough, as time marches forward, it will make its way to a product that is available. So I find that framework really useful for me as I think about lots of things, but particularly technology, and think about where does it sit on that spectrum. Now, as we think about some of the key ingredients for leveraging AI in a business context, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but one thing is that you need access to your data and to be able to train a model. So the way McKinsey were able to create their own large language model is that they've got all that information available to them in a format that they can load into the large language model and train it for their custom purpose. That training requires computing power, and then from there you need to think about how you're going to integrate that into your workflow. Further down the line, you've got your ethical and commercial considerations, and I happen to work in the consulting field as well, and I know things like privacy and copyright are significant considerations. So putting your information into ChatGPT, dialogue box, who knows where that information is going? You'd want to be very mindful if you're dealing with something that's sensitive or private, because it could very well end up as part of a training set for use by that company. So I think that's an example why someone like McKinsey, a large company, would invest in creating their own. But where does that leave small businesses? I think they've still got to wrestle with these considerations. And then there's judgment for how and when to use it. Is it the right thing for every task? And we're going to talk a bit about that more. We've already touched on the human factor and how do we avoid losing that. This is just a smattering of I guess, screenshots from various tools. I'm sure you've seen many of them, and I guess this is the point that AI is just seeping into everything we do. The black one here is Notion, which is a tool that we use in the center as storing and generating documents, and everything seems to want to autocomplete the sentence for you now. Let me summarize it for you. Let me translate it. Let me fill it in. Let me make you an image. Upload the PDF and we can chat with it. I think this one in the middle is quite interesting around Salesforce, have got their own variant of this kind of thing. I think there's going to be an interesting dynamic that is emerging around all of these platforms, these businesses that are providing so much utility to small businesses in particular, have a very strong incentive to keep you within their ecosystem, where they basically control your data and can leverage it or decide how AI is applied to that data. And so, the headline here of small businesses as consumers versus creators, I think, is a really central question. And when we think about how do we educate small businesses about their options and the implications of their decisions, of whether they just remain consumers of technology products, and to what degree does that influence their ability to have any control over their destiny and to do things that are perhaps a bit different to their peers and competitors. I say that largely, I'm trying to say that without judgment. I think I'm just trying to sort of state what I think is. But yeah, I guess I do think that there's a risk with completely handing over the keys and outsourcing to large corporate product companies who have a strong incentive to keep you in their ecosystem and be extracting as much value from the businesses they serve. These are just a couple of examples of some courses. One on the left is happening as we speak. Interestingly, again, sponsored by Salesforce, giving practical AI for small business. And as I delved into the detail of that, a lot around what I would consider fairly high-level concepts, safety, ethics, how to apply it. They say they'll get into some of the practicalities, but I think from my interactions with a lot of people in small business, still getting their head around just the concepts and the basic applications of AI. I personally haven't seen many examples of getting beyond using ChatGPT to write some marketing copy or those kinds of things. Whereas on the right, there's a course, it's one I'm actually doing at the moment, and that's offered by Every, who are they sort of collate business writing and newsletters. But it's actually a 4-week course on how to build a chatbot in GPT-4, and it's quite challenging still at the moment. I've worked in technology. I haven't been a coder, but I understand those concepts. And when I think about a small business person facing into that opportunity of how might I build my own chatbot that uses my own proprietary information, the hurdle is still quite high. It requires basically software engineering capabilities. So it feels like there's quite a gap at the moment in terms of either playing ball with the consumer grade products that everybody's using and the platforms are controlling, or you need to have basically software engineers or that capability in-house to be able to navigate the current spectrum of tools and options. So through Forward, and I'll hand over to Peter in a second, but we're really exploring what are the needs and opportunities with small business in terms of learning to apply these technologies. How can we get beyond just the sort of the higher level and perhaps slightly fluffier considerations around ethics, and still important, but there's several layers down we've got to get before we get to thinking about application and value creation from using these technologies. So we're on that journey and developing some ideas and materials, and it'll be great through the course of this discussion to hear your thoughts and feedback on that. But before that, I'll hand over to Peter to open up the next segment of our presentation.
All right, thanks, Pete. So, I was looking at the comments about hopes and fears coming through in the chat, and we've got all those same hopes and fears too. That AI will destroy the world, or AI will empower everybody to live a happy, shiny life. It's entirely unknown which of those outcomes or blends of those outcomes will happen. But we're actually taking, as Pete said at the beginning, we're cited in a very practical end of education, which is to train people to do things. And so we are kind of approaching this from the point of view of, okay, this technology is around. I'm just reading the book by, whose name I've immediately forgotten. I'll find out in a second. Book by Mustafa Suleyman, who's the founder of DeepMind, that was bought by Google. It's a really interesting, I'm listening to it. It's a really interesting listen if you get the chance. It's called The Coming Wave, and it talks about the next range of disruptive technologies. And he's actually very pessimistic about the idea of what these technologies will do, and that they need reining in. You really need to try and control them and contain them, in like as happened with nuclear weapons, decades ago. That kind of concerted action needs to happen. But we've got all those hopes and fears about that. But actually, we are kind of interested in, okay, this stuff's around, what are we going to do with it? And we're approaching this partly from our own perspective of where we are in the world. We looked at the Padlet. We're in Australia. It's a big place. Everybody's gathered in the capital cities, but there's a lot of regional, remote communities that actually where small businesses make up 97% of our GDP anyway, of our economic activity anyway. So we're thinking about all those people that don't have access to the kinds of tools and resources that McKinsey does or any other big corporation. How do you make a start to understand that? So we're running a program for which we're seeking, or got support already for some of it, to try and give those small business owners, whether it's one person in a business or 10 people in a business, it doesn't matter what they do, the ability to try and get to grips with what value this can bring from them. So we're not assuming that this would be applicable for everyone, because actually Pete and I were in a conversation yesterday about creativity and the nature of what this kind of technology does to human creativity. And in fact, it does some really quite difficult things to it, but equally it could be incredibly empowering. So we wanted to try and drive an education campaign for small businesses and help them understand through a whole range of quite sensitive co-designed activities. And I've picked one example of something that, to give it some real particularity, is cooperative. So a cooperative, which I'm sure you know about, there are quite a few of them in Australia, member-owned businesses, and they really give people the opportunity to get involved through ownership of their business. 8 in 10 Australians, we found out because we were doing a bit of work in cooperatives, are members of at least one cooperative. Sorry, cancel my phone. Members of at least one cooperative. And our example that I'll talk about in the next slide very briefly is some social care, aged care, and disability. So there are lots of cooperatives that deliver those kinds of services, especially in remote and rural areas, real services for citizens. There are a few in Australia, but in Italy, we only found this out recently, that something like 14,000 cooperatives are around that provide care to quite a large section of the population. Now, if you run a cooperative, which is a member-owned business that delivers social care, and that can be social and aged care or mental health care or disability care, there are lots of challenges that you face as a business. So it's logistically difficult. You have to bring together lots of specialists and carers and liaise with families and liaise with patients and develop healthcare plans. There's lots of stuff. It's incredibly regulatory onerous. You've got to comply with a whole bunch of regulation. It's really difficult to deal with government funding schemes. And you have to maintain open lines of communication with family members. So it's not just a matter of delivering one piece of service. It's actually quite difficult to run this kind of business. But you need, at the same time, to provide excellent levels of care. The downside is, of course, that these businesses don't have the luxury of McKinsey consultants where they can innovate. They're occupied with delivering care, and they've got aging IT systems, almost no budget, and really poor IT support. Skip on a slide. There we are. So what could generative AI in its broadest sense bring to those kinds of businesses. And this is the challenge that we want to try and face as we face into supporting small businesses to try and use this technology for good. So in the social cooperative, social healthcare context, you could use AI to develop personalized care plans, which is an example. I asked ChatGPT to give me a list of potential of its own applications to this. And these are some of the things it came up with. Mental health support, we've seen lots of examples of using generative AI for good and bad, I have to say, to provide mental health support. You could certainly use it for scheduling. We've used it to schedule things. The back-end automation of things like contracts with vendors and service providers, predictive analytics, all those things are generative AI is very, very good at. Very, very good at dealing with the details and intricacies of plans. And then, as Pete will talk about in a minute, there's a whole bunch of chatbots and voice applications that face into people, in this case, patients and people who are being cared for, and chatbots, for example, to automate the collection of feedback. So those benefits and opportunities are the ones that we are going to try and help businesses, small businesses in very different sectors try and face into. With the idea is, or worry is, of course, that those folks are going to get left behind. So they will not see the benefits of this kind of technology because as it gets more complex, Pete drew that timeline of things from Genesis. It's been AI has been around 50 years more, but it's only been in the last sort of 10 to 15 years that this stuff starts accelerating. In fact, if you read Mustafa Suleyman's book, he pinpoints the moment as when DeepMind won the game of Go against the world's leading player. That he reckons that's the moment when it all really started because it was neural network based, whether that's true or not. But the worry is that as this gets more complicated, there are more and more every week and every day new products are launched. If you keep up with this stuff like we do, it comes in my news feed, and every day there's a new product of some description that's based on yet another variant of generative AI, LLM, image generation, whatever it might be. Our worry is that the majority of people who make up the economy will get left behind. And not only, of course, those who run small businesses, but those who are excluded, marginalized, or disadvantaged in some way from participating in the economy, maybe people who might benefit the most from understanding this kind of technology. Pete.
Thanks, Peter. And just to round out our little segment here, and I guess just continuing on this theme, and we just wanted to try and make this really tangible for you all as we think about this broad theme of education, AI, and small business, with this case study about the social care cooperative, and now thinking about specifically how a chatbot or leveraging this type of style of generative AI enable them. And just a few points here to start with, that a key asset is this procedural knowledge about how they reliably and consistently deliver the service that they deliver. And I think one of the a key word in that sentence there is that it's an asset, but how does that exist? And if that is naturally going to be in people's heads, in their experience, in their conversations and relationships, that is entirely natural and appropriate. But in terms of being able to leverage that in the context of AI, it's got to be transformed into something that can be fed into the machine for the purpose of training. So I think from a education perspective, that's a consideration. It's like, what are people doing today, at least? Because if you can't retrospectively necessarily change things, but maybe going forward in terms of the way that things are captured, documented, stored, tagged, that kind of thing. It's a very brief sidebar, but I've just finished a 2-year home renovation journey, and working with building companies, and I'm astounded that there's not really a skerrick of technology to be seen. Everything done over the phone, maybe a text message, maybe an email, but when I think about, that as an example of an industry and an experience, very little there to harness and use to train something like a chatbot to then be able to unlock future value, at least in my experience there. I know that's not across the board, but I think particularly, say, in this social care situation, I'll be thinking about, well, what kinds of things in terms of that asset of procedural knowledge, how can that be captured in a way that can be used to train a model? Things like policy compliance, I think, is probably a bit easier, and that stuff's often already written down and available in a machine readable format, so that can be fed in. And things like upskilling and maintaining a workforce is a really key challenge for these types of social care cooperatives. So this is where I think there's a real opportunity in terms of being able to give people a head start. We've seen other sort of studies and statistics about the drastic decrease in time that it takes for someone to go from zero to competent. You're sort of talking about halving that from, say, 6 months to 3 months with the aid of these kinds of tools.